Okay, so today I'm going to tell you a little bit about mobile learning, building on the work we were doing last week, talking about digital games. We're going to explore how to use different kinds of mobile devices in the classroom. So one of the things that this session is going to do is, when we actually get into the session, is going to give you some hands-on experience. Obviously, this is a precursor. This is a recording so that you can look at it in advance, so you can think about things. It's going to allow you to reflect on how you might start using mobile devices in education. I'll bring in obviously some other ideas from other places, and also get you to consider issues around when you might use them and when you decide not to use them, because that's an important decision as well. Maybe times when you feel that it's not necessary, as you know, when you're making choices about what technologies to use. So in the session, we're going to use a piece of software called Todaysmeet. Todaysmeet is a way of recording ongoing activity, in the sense of you log in, you can ask questions, you can do it anonymously. We can get feedback from the group, so it allows people to kind of engage with stuff. So we're going to use this as an alternative. It's not quite a mobile tool, but it will work on a mobile phone. So we're going to use this. So I'll set this up in the session so you can explore this, how it works. So we're going to use this tool, and I'm going to get you to give me feedback as we go through. So the idea then of this session is to just give you some background and talk through some of the issues that might arise when we consider mobiles in the classroom. So, as I've implied in other sessions, we've been talking about technology for a long time, and it goes back into the 1950s, so many years ago really now, with a guy called Skinner. And he was trying to create what he called teaching machines. And Bill Gates has had his views of this. He's tried to persuade people that to get with the use of technology in the classroom. And he's right in saying that in many ways the technology we use now is it hasn't really changed the nature of education. And he says this is going to be the case by from 10 years from 2009, which is of course 2019, that things are going to change dramatically. So we've got 2 years to go. So you might like to think about that for a bit. So I will give you a chance in the session to actually discuss that, and we'll use Todaysmeet to get some feedback. So just think about it. Think about your education at school. Think about what you did when you went to college, and now at university. What's your view? Has education been changed by technology? So we'll come back to this at a later stage in the session. So why are we concerned with mobiles? Why are we interested in mobiles? How are they different from other technologies, assuming that they are? And one of the issues is because there are just so many of them in the world. So many people have access to them. Part of the work that I do in the university, part of my research work, is looking at using mobiles with refugee teachers. So I work in Jordan, in the Zaatari refugee camp, and we're looking at ways of trying to get materials to these teachers so they can use it in classes. So we have to work offline with these materials. They don't have good access to the internet, so we're exploring ways that might happen. And you can see from this map that there's an enormous number of mobile phones in the world, and they as well as many people having them, many people in countries like Britain or France or the United States or whatever, or China, many people have these technologies, but we don't really exploit them very effectively in education. And this is illustrated by this particular this infographic that we can link to and find out more about. But essentially, it's talking about the way that children end up going to school with technology. So if you look along the bottom of it, you'll see that in the early stages, the children tend not to be going to school with a smartphone, but by the time they get into high school, about 50% of children do have access to them. But at the same time, there are people in the families that own the phone that a child uses. There are other devices like e-readers, and there are tablets. So these are technologies that are widely available, but actually they're not used a lot in schools. And if you have a look at this infographic, you can click on it and access it. So there's a link. It's linked to it. It actually explains that when they talk to parents of children, there was a lot of enthusiasm for the idea that phones ought to be used more in schools. That parents actually thought it was a good idea, and when they looked at the research, it seemed that children seemed to be actually getting something from this. So there again, there's lots of groundswell of arguments. I mean, on the other side of the coin, if you want to take a kind of critical view of this, you might say, well, the mobile companies would say that, wouldn't they? Because of course, they want to sell more phones, they want to sell data, they want to get you to use these tools, and of course it also saves schools money, it saves universities money. The fact that I get you to bring your devices to the classroom means I don't have to provide devices. So it could be argued that it's not fair to ask students or pupils to bring these technologies for all sorts of reasons into the classroom. So you can see both sides of the argument, but there's no way of denying that there are plenty of them about, and if they can be utilized effectively, kind of why not? And rather than schools having providing technology like we were talking about again last week, then it seems to make sense for children to use their own technologies, partly because they're going to learn maybe more about those technologies, and they might not just use them for social media or for chatting with their friends and these kinds of things. They might actually realize the potential of the technology. I mean, they may already have quite a lot of insights, but perhaps some children don't necessarily have the same insights. So Pegram, writing back in 2014, makes a really interesting distinction between different types of mobility for learning. He has 3 types. He talks about a time when in a classroom when you can use the mobile to kind of move things around, or within the school, so you can go around, you can do things, you can take photographs, and you can show each other what you're doing. You can move people easily around the classroom. So it's not fixed. It's not like a computer lab. It's difficult to organize. You can do group work easily, and so on and so forth. So the machine is mobile, if you like. The second scenario is when the learners themselves are actually mobile, when the learners are moving out in the world. It might be that you listen to this piece of material, this podcast as we might call it, on the bus into the university, or on the train, or it might be something that you do in another place, in the library or something like that. So the idea is that the device then is mobile. The device is moving around, it's carrying things with it, it's got information on it, and so on. And then the last scenario is where the actual experience, the learning experience itself, is mobile, in the sense that you might end up going to a museum or an art gallery. You might be in the street. You might sort of find out that there's a virtual reality tour or an augmented reality tour of the local city, and you learn about the city with your phone. You point your phone at a building. the building, gives you information about that building, who lived there, and what happened at a certain date, and so on and so forth. So you get these virtual tours of cities. You get that kind of information when you go to a museum, or you might go out on a field trip in geography or something. You might take pictures, you might record data on the device, and then you bring that back to class. So the links on this page are to talks that Mark Pegram has done about this. So he's got this useful way of sort of seeing what you might do with devices. So if we're always doing things in the classroom, then maybe we're not exploiting the mobile phone in the most effective way. And a lot of the basic arguments about mobile are very similar to the arguments that I made last week about digital games. So, these new technologies that we bring into education, they allow us to look at things in a different way. So maybe it makes activities more attractive. So there's a commonly used word, this notion of affordance. So it provides opportunities for doing things in a different kind of way. You've got that notion again of anywhere, anytime learning that comes in a lot. And the thing I think is really interesting here in this quotation from McQuiggan et al. Is the notion of a personalized world. So in a sense, your machine embodies you. So it takes on some kind of your persona. It becomes part of what you do. So you download the apps you're interested in. You maybe decorate the phone in a certain kind of way. It's a very personalized thing. You feel at a loss if you don't have access to it. We're doing things like, it says they're redefining the responsibilities of teachers and students. So in the same sort of way that I've been getting you to try and work independently, so you have to find materials for yourselves, you have to work together, you support each other's. So it's not me that's giving you information. I mean, I am doing that now, but in other sessions that hasn't been the case. And one of the other things that it does is, it extends that blurring between formal and informal learning. So increasingly, access to information or learning is occurring in that informal space that isn't part of the university or the school. It's occurring, when you go out. It's occurring, when you do, something like a MOOC that we talked about. So, it's mixing and matching access to information or to knowledge or to resources and things like that. So the mobiles give you, instant access to resources, so you can immediately download something and look at it wherever you are. So going back to the idea of in a museum, if you see a display in a museum, you can quickly look something up, or maybe you can download an article that talks about the particular the particular exhibition you're looking at. Or maybe you're in a gallery and you see a picture and you want to find out a bit more about the artist or about that particular picture. You can actually get that information. Now, of course, galleries and museums provide information, but there's always that opportunity to extend that. So there's a formal process that you go through, and there's also the informal learning that you go through as well. So while mobility is important, there are other things that mobiles bring to learning or to classrooms as well. And I mentioned that idea of the notion that you're trying to experience opportunities, you're trying to look at evolution, you're trying to change the nature of what you're doing with the technology. So this is a model that's sometimes put forward to get teachers to think about maybe doing more than just substituting what you do in the classroom. So instead of substituting a pen for a typewriter, looking at ways that you might add something to the text that you're creating. So you might add in additional pictures, or it adds something extra to the material. It might allow you to then take it up another stage, so you end up modifying the task completely. So instead of creating something that is a written text, you might end up creating a video. So you tell a story in a different kind of way, and maybe ultimately you completely change the nature of the way that you're doing education. So education isn't done within the four walls of the classroom, it's done outside, a bit like the kind of work that Paul Driver does, where he takes his students out into the community. They go and visit small businesses, and they get the stories of those businesses, they record them, they bring them back to class. So they're doing history in the real world, and then they're creating materials about that, they're putting that online, and so on and so forth. So you get that notion of mobiles maybe significantly sort of changing the nature. So trying to do the sorts of things that Bill Gates was talking about. So actually, it's completely kind of rethinking the way that education is, and getting people to engage in a very different kind of way with what learning is about. So let's look at some of the technologies. And one of the ways I like to start this is by actually thinking about the pre-existing technologies that are on your phone or your tablet, without adding any kind of additional apps. So the first one, a good place to start is the stills camera. Obviously, it also acts as a video camera as well, but we're always taking photographs. People have always got a photograph on their phone. So it really is a good place to sort of think about what can you do with pictures. And then there are a range of other apps that you can use in various kind of educational contexts. You've got a clock, getting people to sort of think about time zones, even doing simple maths with it, sort of what's the time zone now, we're about to change the time, what's that going to make a difference, how is that going to be different in different parts of the world, how do other people change times, why do they change times, why don't they change times. I mean, you've got sort of strange tools like the photo booth on the iPad, very much phone specific. You've also got audio recording on most portable devices, although on the iPad you actually have to download an app to do that. Recording is something that's very good. You can use that if say you're back in your museum again, and you meet somebody at the museum and you want to kind of capture their experiences of that museum. You might talk to one of the people who work in the museum. They might tell you a bit about an exhibition. You can record that kind of thing. You've got calendars, you've got maps, and so on. So again, in the session, I'm going to get you to think back to your experiences in school. I want you to look at a tool, try and pick a tool that's from the tool set, and think about how you use it. And I want you to keep some notes on that. So I don't want you to do that now. I just want you to think a little bit about, how, what you did at school, and your experiences of technology in school, how it kind of came about. Did you ever use mobile phones? If not, when did you get access to them? Were you using them by the time you got into sixth form? Did they actually use them, or were they banned? That kind of thing. And then sort of talk a bit about that. What were your experiences of doing that, and try and take some notes about that on a note-taking app. And it's interesting to see, I've just recently upgraded to the new Notes app on iOS 11, and it's got some interesting enhancements. You can actually create within that a pretty multimedia document. I mean, I haven't really got into it yet, but the first bit's handwritten, and then I've recorded with voice the second bit. And I've gone back to handwriting text, and of course you can type things in, but so you can make quite sophisticated documents even just with the simple what was just a very basic note tool in the early stages of development of the iPhone or the iPad. So coming back to McQuiggan again, just a reminder that we're not always necessarily talking about mobile phones here, of course, or tablets. We're talking about a whole range of different tools. And we ought to keep that in mind, that it's not essential for these things to be phones, although of course they make life much easier. And one of the key things that has to be made available is internet access. I mean, so you can get content on demand. This is a kind of an absolute must really in any educational context, to be able to easily kind of access the internet. And also you should be able to do this as you travel around and visit other spaces as well. So it's really important to have that accessibility. Of course, as McQuiggan again says, it's much easier to use devices if they're available. But if they're not available, you're not allowed to use your own device in the school, which is what the earlier infogram is about. Then there might be ways of doing that provide you with some kind of access. So using cameras, using other kinds of recording devices, maybe using laptops for doing some other functionality that you get with the mobile phone. So even if mobile phones are not accessible, you can do a lot of the activities in other ways. And I think it's important to bear that in mind as we go through this sort of transitional period until phones are readily accepted in an educational environment. So let's turn to what we might call non-native apps. And we've already talked a little bit about responseware. We did some work with Kahoot last time. There's another tool called Socrative. We're using Todaysmeet today as a way of feeding back. And you can also use Google Forms as a way of collecting information. And I'm going to show you an example of how to use Google Forms now, basically. And so this is an activity that's based around a Google form. Google Forms are essentially a kind of a questionnaire tool, but you can use them in quite creative ways. So I picked this piece of material about a bit about sport, about kayaking and canoeing, and I've created an activity around it using the Google form. And I've talked a lot about Google tools, but the reason for that is because they are popular. If you look at there's a website by a person called Jane Hart, and it's got a whole series of different bits of information. But one of the things it has is a table of all of the different uses of technology, not just in education, but there is a sort of section that's mostly about education. And you'll see, if you look at that, you'll see that the Google Drive Docs combination comes out near the top or at the top very often, and it's intriguing to see how those things are resisted. And I have my reservations about them, but at the same time they've got lots of useful facilities, useful affordances, to use that term, that allow you to do lots of interesting things, as hopefully you're discovering from working on your documents together. But of course there are other writing apps. We always must say this, there are other apps available, and I think I might have mentioned Evernote, which I find a very useful tool. And then there are more kind of commercially oriented apps like Write, which originally a Mac word processor, a bit like Word, and of course now you can get Word itself in limited ways onto your mobile device as well, if you want to use particular writing apps for recording, taking notes in different contexts. Then there are what we might call brainstorming apps of various types, ways of creating summaries of information or using for planning. And then there are what I refer to as generic apps, things like travel, shopping, media, newspaper, sports, all of these kinds of things that can be linked to different areas of the curriculum, be it things to do with maths or to do with geography, to do with social studies, to measure performance while you're doing sports, and so on and so forth. So all of these things, can be linked in many different ways to different curricular areas. You've got history material. You've got, there are lots of things that you can look at. There are lots of videos available on the internet, and they can also be viewed on mobile phones, as I'm sure you're well aware. There are all the TED materials. There's also TED for Education. There's Khan Academy. There are other tools providing listening material. Audio Boo, for example. Then there's Audible, that is the Amazon listening material, so books read. There's VoiceThread for creating your own stories and uploading material. Lots and lots of these kinds of materials available. Lots of reading material that you can find, different forms, and again I'll show you some examples of this in the classroom. This is a nice little introduction to teaching reading, particularly in English language teaching. This is aimed at, and using different kinds of ebooks. So this is quite an interesting set of materials, and it talks about the way that materials are configured. But of course, we teach other languages in schools, and there are similar resources, and we teach mainstream mother tongue English as well, and children need to learn to access the different kind of material at different levels of education. So this kind of activity can be utilized in regular primary and secondary school classrooms. I give you an example of a scavenger hunt. So this is a way of organizing material in what's called a scavenger hunt or a web quest, and you can use QR codes. So as a teacher, you can kind of preordain what people set for on the internet, so they're not tempted to go off and look at any old website. You actually get them looking for specific things, so you can build this around different topics. So as you'll see from the activity we do in class, that then it's possible to design it for a variety of different topics, and that uses what's called a QR code reader, which you're probably familiar with. And then we have a movement away from kind of QR codes to augmented reality, where you use different triggers in the environment to give you information. So I mentioned sort of tours in a city, or you can use these for field trips. There's for example, at Manchester, they've created one, geology field trips using QR code readers. And we'll come back to this later in the semester when we get a visit from the people from the library who will talk more about these kinds of things. So if you're going to look at QR codes, you need a QR code reader, and you need a way of creating the QR codes. But they're quite fun, and you can make a variety of different types of activities using them. So in the classroom, I want you to then kind of pick an app. I want you to begin to think about how that might relate to the kinds of subject areas you come from. It could be English language education, it could be the earlier subjects you studied, or maybe if you're thinking of going to work in schools later on. I know that some of you are. You might sort of think about, well, how might I pick an app, and how might I begin to, if I think about a particular subject that I was taught or an activity that I did in school, how might you begin to use that. And I want you to think about how you might, if you were going to do a presentation on that, that there are a series of teacher apps that we can actually make use of, like presentation apps, or Google Slides, or this kind of thing, that you can utilize to actually talk about things, or get the students to talk about those. So there's a few references, the things that I've been talking about, the references I made in the slides. So hopefully you'll have a chance to listen to this and work through it, follow up some of the links, and we'll use the class time to actually do a bunch of activities. So I hope you've got something from this, and that we can have a discussion about it in the session.